In the mid-1990s, a series of homemade videotapes surfaced after the death of a young man who documented his obsession in isolation. Alone in a dim room, he spoke to the camera as if it were a confidant, recording rituals, delusions, and a growing sense of destiny. The tapes end abruptly, leaving behind an unsettling portrait of fixation unchecked, and a reminder that some horrors are built quietly, frame by frame, long before anyone notices. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. My name's Greg, and after listening to a lot of your stories since the holidays, I figured I'd share one of my own from my time with Colorado parks and wildlife. And this story starts with a type of fish, the Colorado pike minnow. Overfishing reduced the pike minnow's numbers dramatically over the years, and then when the rivers started getting underpopulated, settlers introduced invasive species to replace them, and they were driven out of their native spawning grounds. Unlike the northern pike minnow, on which there are pretty generous bounties, fishermen have to throw the native pike minnows back. If they don't, they face hefty fines or even prison time for repeated offenders. But reinforcing the law out there in the wild is no easy task. I'd say maybe 90% of the hunters and fishermen in the state of Colorado are respectable and responsible sportsmen. But that other 10% mean we're forced to send officers into state parks and sometimes up into the mountains to ensure they're following the rules. And in the late summer of 1993, that's exactly what I was tasked to do among the lakes and rivers of the Weminuche Wilderness area. At almost 800 square miles, the Weminuche is the largest wilderness area in the state of Colorado. We got the San Juan and Rio Grande rivers both flowing through the area, which in turn feed the Rio Blanco, Navajo, and Piedra rivers. And then when it comes to lakes, Weminuche's got 11 of them, all spaced around within the 780 square miles. I guess now you understand what a task we're faced with in terms of monitoring such a vast area. And when you head out into the Weminuche, you really are heading out into the middle of goddamn nowhere. The same could be said for the task that I was given back in the summer of 1993. I was asked to survey the area around a body of water called Granite Lake, which was home to about a dozen different rivers, lakes, and streams. Naturally, it's popular with fishermen, but it's also pretty far from any road, and a lot of it's on the northern slopes of Granite Peak. That makes it just about hidden away as it's possible to get out there, meaning if anyone was looking to do a little illegal pick minnow fishing, it'd most likely be there. On top of that, there was an old ranger cabin out there on Granite Peak's southern slope, one that had been serviced as recently as 18 months prior. That meant that it'd take some cleaning up, but it'd be livable for at least a day or two while I did my survey. I remember making my way out there in mid-July, and I had to be on the trail by 5:30 in the morning just to make it out there by noon. The cabin wasn't as bad as I pictured, and then once I got done getting settled in, I decided to make my way down Granite Peak towards the lake of the same name. The woods were nice and quiet, and the shores of Granite Lake were derelict too. I could see the place from up on high, how quiet and tranquil it looked. So instead of heading all the way down there, I split off northwest to check out the Los Pinos River. I'd been walking along the bank for maybe 20 minutes or so when I saw my first fisherman standing off in the distance. He looked calm and peaceful, just sitting there on his little camping stool, watching the water with his rod in his hand. I didn't want to call out from too far off because that'd be loud enough to frighten any animals, including his fish, and so I waited until I was a little closer before saying nothing more than, "Afternoon, sir." Now, I wasn't expecting the friendliest reaction. Fishermen are generally pretty wary whenever they're approached by strangers, but this guy just about jumped out of his skin. For a moment, it looked like he was going for a gun or something, but when he saw me, he sighed with relief so hard that he almost looked like a balloon deflating. I told him I was sorry for spooking him like I did, and then introduced myself as a wildlife officer and told him what my business was. Now, the whole time he's looking at me with this sort of expression that was half confused and half nervous. Then when I asked him if he'd caught any pike minnows recently, He completely ignored my question and only asked if they knew I was there. I assumed that he meant my superiors in the CPW, so I told him sure they did, that I didn't go anywhere without their say-so. And then once again, I asked if he'd caught any pike minnows recently. Now that time, not only did the guy look at me like I was speaking another language, but he started looking around as if he was expecting me to have company. And that's the point that I started to get suspicious, because not only was this guy completely ducking my questions, but he seemed worried that he was about to be arrested or something. And I told him he wasn't in any trouble, that the first-timers always get away with a warning not to do it again, but he didn't even seem to be listening at that point. When he tuned back in, he told me they wouldn't like me being out there, not without permission. Now, I was halfway to telling him that I already had permission when I realized that's not what he was asking. I asked him who he meant when he said they, and after taking another look around us, he told me with just the slightest hint of a grin that they don't like you saying their name. And the response gave me pause, obviously. Not so much because of what he said, but the wry smirk on his face as he said it. I'd had fishermen and hunters try to intimidate me off their patches before, so it wasn't like I was unaccustomed to it. I just never had anyone do it with such a Twilight Zone kind of line like that. I decided to humor him a little and asked why they wouldn't like me being in the area. And he gave me some scatterbrained speech about how it was their land and I needed to seek permission to be there. Then, when I asked how I might go about doing that, he told me to leave something outside the cabin at night. If they took it, that was their permission. If not, then I was to leave immediately. With just a hint of sarcasm, I told the guy, message received, but that the next time a wildlife officer was up there and found him fishing for pike minnow, he couldn't say I didn't warn him. I mean, I really did think he was just trying to spook me into leaving the area without doing my job, and so that's exactly how I treated it. I thanked him for his time, again with a hint of sarcasm, and then carried on walking along the riverbank. But as I did, he called out to me, and when I turned, he told me in so many words, "Best advice I can give you is to leave a little food behind, maybe some money too, and hope they see it fit to let you walk out of here." I just rolled my eyes, told them they better, unless they wanted the FBI roaming around in force, and then kept going on my way. Now, I was back at the cabin by sundown, having spotted not a single other fisherman anywhere on the rivers or lakes. And after lighting a campfire, I started on prepping a little camp food in the form of some boil-in-the-bag Mexican chicken and rice. But as I was eating, I noticed something on the ground. I've been walking all over the area outside the camp, so my boot prints were everywhere in the dirt. But in between two tracks of my own creation, there was a footprint that I didn't recognize. First off, it wasn't shaped like a boot print. It was slightly narrower and longer, so more like a shoe of some kind. But unlike my own tracks, which left a clear impression of my boot's treads in the dirt, the print I didn't recognize had a very unusual but strangely familiar sort of tread pattern. It took me a second to realize why it was so familiar, but then it clicked. It was the tread of a tire from a car or a truck. And after shining my flashlight on it, I could clearly see the two parallel vertical lines, and then the smaller horizontal ones which gave it that sort of ribbed pattern. The tracks were fresh too, at least made that day fresh, which meant that whoever had been walking around the cabin had done so either before my arrival or after I'd settled in and went off to check the rivers. I didn't like the idea of someone having walked around the cabin while I was away, but it didn't seem like they'd been inside or touched any of my stuff, so I wasn't too alarmed. But there were two thoughts that I couldn't seem to shake. First off, I figured the fisherman I spoke to might have stopped by to talk or something, but found the cabin empty. It made sense if he knew the area well, and it also wasn't out of the question that he wanted to apologize for getting off on the wrong foot. But whoever had walked around the cabin had done so in what looked like homemade shoes with soles made of rubber tires. And while I remember a handful of details about the fisherman, homemade footwear was not one of them. And this led me to the second thought that I couldn't shake, and this thought concerned who the fisherman had referred to only as they. Now, I assumed they were nothing but a fabrication intended to scare me away from the area, But if it hadn't been the fisherman who was walking around my cabin just a few hours before, then who the hell did? It was maybe an hour or two past sundown by the time I was checking out the weird shoe prints, so too late to just back up and get out of there. At least, not without the risk of getting lost out there in the dark. It was my first time there and all. But aside from that, I wasn't even close to being spooked enough to pack my stuff up and run. I mean, sure, it was weird that whoever walked past my cabin had very probably made their own shoes, but if they wanted me gone, they could have just as easily trashed my cabin or maybe even set it on fire. I didn't even know for certain where the tracks led, as, like I said, I figured somebody probably just walked past it while heading to or from their favorite fishing hole, maybe. And that's when I decided to follow them, with my flashlight as best I could. And that's how I found out that they led all the way around my cabin and then up towards Granite Peak. And then on a rise which overlooked the cabin by maybe 70 to 80 yards, I found another set of strange shoe prints which joined the others. I could see two sets of very firm prints in the dirt, one of which seemed to match those at my cabin's campfire, and two that were very different. They had the same kind of tread, two vertical lines and many horizontals, but their positioning was visibly different from that of the first, meaning in my best estimations, whoever had walked around my cabin had been joined by someone else as they watched it from a distance, and from the looks of things, they did so for quite some time too. Now that's when I started to get a little spooked, because it was one thing for someone to just walk around the cabin, maybe out of curiosity, and it was another thing entirely to just sit there watching it. And then while it was quite possible that the two guys just wanted to rest for a little bit before continuing their journey, it didn't sit right with me that they chose to do so in a place that overlooked my sleeping arrangement and while facing it too. But still, I wasn't all that worried. I might have only been a wildlife officer, but they didn't send us out there defenseless. I carried handcuffs, a smaller can of bear mace that can fit into my belt, and I carried my M&P 45 too, and since that thing packs enough punch to take down a bear, you can bet your ass it's got enough punch to take down a person or two. I felt more capable of defending myself against whoever might decide to pay me a visit, and besides, I only had to spend one night there to get the job done, and then the following afternoon, I'd be able to start making my way back towards the highway and to where my truck was parked. And so I chose to stay the night and complete my work, and in doing so, made a very grave and almost fatal mistake. Now, the cabin was little more than a one-room shack with one door, one bed, and one window. There was a chair in one corner and an empty wooden chest in the other, and then aside from a little sign on the wall which said the cabin was property of the state of Colorado, the walls were completely bare, and the place looked sturdy enough. And then since I was able to lock the doors and shutter the window, I figured that it'd be as safe a place as any to spend the night, especially since I had my gun with me too. And since I was technically federal law enforcement, I used to get tested on my shooting about twice a year, so while I wasn't still convinced that I was in danger, I felt very confident in my abilities to actually defend myself, like I said. But there was just one thing that I didn't like about the cabin, and that's how there was a mail slot on the front door. The mailbox was gone, so it was just a rectangular slot in the door with a thin, hinged hatch to cover it. But since the bed stood almost perfectly in front of it, and there was no way of keeping it closed, I decided to shift the furniture around a little before I got any sleep. I didn't want anyone being able to push the barrel of a shotgun through that thing in the middle of the night, or if they did, I didn't want to be lying right there in front of it when it did. But something did come through that mailbox, and it sure as hell wasn't a shotgun. I slept very poorly that night, and I tend not to sleep great in new places, especially when they're out in the middle of the woods, because I'm such a light sleeper that so much as a rustle outside wakes me up. And I think that I must have been in and out about 12.5 times before I woke up to the strange silence in the cabin, and right away, that struck me as a bit odd. The woods are noisy at night, sometimes noisier than the daytime if you're not counting for bird song, because all the critters that only come out at night start scurrying around, chittering and chirping and fighting amongst themselves. I'd lost count of how many times I woke up to hear something growling or barking or sniffling outside the cabin, and so to suddenly wake up and hear none of it, that set me on edge right away. The absence of any other sound then made it much easier to hear this gentle scraping sound that seemed to be coming from near the front door. And then I looked, and I could see moonlight creeping through the hatch, which appeared to have been pushed open by something. In my half-sleep state, I figured that it might have been that shotgun that I'd been so terrified of, so I grabbed my flashlight and pistol and then got ready to put a few rounds through the door and whoever was on the other side. Thankfully, it wasn't a shotgun, but seeing what it actually was didn't make me feel any better, because reaching through the mailbox and up towards the lock keeping the door shut was a man's arm. It wasn't just the arm which scared me, though. It was the condition it was in. I remember how the arm was partially covered by a dark red sweater, how the skin underneath looked weathered and worn, but how the muscle underneath was very clearly defined. This person was strong, very strong, and by the looks of things, hygiene, and in particular nail care, didn't seem to be their strong suit. The guy's hand looked so badly burned it was like it had been dipped in a barrel of acid, like so badly melted and scarred it looked like his fingers were webbed. And then his fingernails, hell, they might as well have been claws. They were long, jagged and chipped with this distinctly yellowy brown sort of color under the bright white of my flashlight, and they were reaching for the lock, getting closer every second while clearly trying to stay as quiet as possible. I just reacted. I had no idea who it was or why they were trying to get into the cabin, but I also knew I wanted to give whoever it was one clear warning before I opened fire. And so I hurled across the cabin in my bare feet and then kind of slammed my shoulder against the guy's arm to crush it against the thick, heavy wood of the front door. I heard a yelp from the other side before the arm suddenly disappeared back through the mailbox. And then I issued my warning, loud and clear. I told whoever it was that the cabin was the property of the state and that inside was an armed federal law enforcement officer. I told them that if they left, there and then, nothing would happen to them. But if they continued to try and gain access to the cabin, someone was going to get shot. I half expected someone to apologize, and I explained that there had been some confusion. It made sense that someone might have been using the place thinking it was abandoned despite the sign, and the last thing I wanted to do was shoot that person dead because they figured they'd locked themselves out by accident. But I didn't hear an apology. I didn't hear any voices at all. There was just silence for a moment or two before suddenly I heard someone banging on the small window shutter. It wasn't banging like someone saying open up. They were trying to break the shutter on the window open, and it only took a couple of more swings of whatever they were holding before the hinges broke and the shutter fell away. After that, all they had to do was smash through the glass, but by then, I had both my flashlight and my .45 trained on that window. So when I saw that rifle barrel get pushed past the broken glass, I fell to my right to minimize my profile and then fired all 10 rounds into the cabin wall where I thought the shooter would be. I saw the flash and smoke of the rifle going off, sending a bullet harmlessly into the cabin wall to my left. But what really caught my attention about that rifle, and what I find myself wondering over all these years later, is the fact that it had a ramrod below the barrel. Now, I can't tell you exactly what kind of rifle it was, although I do have my suspicions, but what I can tell you is how that thing couldn't have been produced any later than about 1890, meaning by the time that guy shot in my direction through that busted cabin window, it had to have been around 100 years old. A rifle like that belongs in a museum, but there it was, fully functional long after it should have been tossed on a scrap heap or locked in a glass case. As I reloaded my pistol, I remember hearing somebody groaning in pain on the other side of the wall, and I called out, "I warned you, buddy!" And I remember how mad I was when I said it too. I was madder than I'd ever been in my entire life, so there may or may not have been a couple of extra curses in there too, but I didn't hear a response, at least not to me. And when I heard someone speaking, who I assumed was the wounded rifleman, I could barely understand a word. Now, it sounded like pidgin English, and I'll try my best to recall it word for word, but don't blame me if it sounds dumb as hell. But I'm being honest here. I think whoever I shot named Benny because I heard someone say, "Benny, what's it do? What's it do, Benny?" The Benny guy seemed to groan something in reply, but I couldn't tell if it was a word or just him whining in pain. And then whoever spoke first said something like,
"Gå så get you to the hogar. Go put you some bad."
I gave them one final warning for them to keep away from the broken window, that it was locked and loaded again, and anything they presented to me was going to get blown to pieces. Again, and I'm assuming it was only 2 guys out there, but neither said anything in response. I just heard groans of pain and then the sound of one guy dragging the other across the forest floor. I wanted to approach the window, shine my flashlight out there and get a damn look at the people who had just tried to kill me, but I also knew that doing so would present them with the same perfectly framed target, so I didn't. I simply stood still as a statue, ears keen for anything that sounded like it was close to the cabin. And I stayed like that, not just till everything was quiet again, but till those natural forest sounds returned and I knew I was relatively safe again. I didn't think it was a particularly good idea to try and run. I didn't know where I was and I'd be making a hell of a lot of noise, and although I was certain I'd injured one of them, I didn't know how many people were out there intent on doing me harm. If I ran, I could end up running right into an ambush of some kind, but then if I stayed, it seemed like only a matter of time before whoever was out there might rustle up some reinforcements and come back to finish me off. It was a long, intense wait before I got the answer to my question, when a bullet suddenly ripped its way through the cabin wall. As I could imagine, seeing the wood splinter and hearing the loud cracks scared the absolute crap out of me. I rolled out of bed and hit the floor, and then, considering my next move, I realized just how much of a sitting duck I truly was. The nightmare scenario was there being more rifles that time, and as I wondered if reinforcements had arrived, a second shot ripped its way through the wood and buried itself in the wood behind me. If they really were using old muzzle loaders and trying to kill me, then there was no way one guy could reload that fast, so there had to be 2 of them out there by that point, and with surefire reinforcements since a badly wounded man couldn't load no muzzle loader. And I didn't know if I was surrounded, if people were moving in closer with knives or hatchets or all that kind of stuff, but I knew that I had to get out of there. And so I ran. I didn't run out shooting like some old western. I just picked my moment, committed to an angle, and then ran as fast as I think I ever did in my entire life. I tripped on something and fell at one point and heard voices behind me, yelling like they were pointing me out, but I was up on my feet and moving again in no time, and despite them firing a shot in my direction, I don't think it got near me. I must have ran for maybe an hour or maybe 2 on and off, coughing and panting till I finally couldn't run anymore and stopped to take an actual breather. I didn't count on anyone having the stamina to follow me, and for a while I thought that I would outrun them, but before long, I heard the sound getting louder and louder, like this rustling that I could hear behind me in the dark coming from up and down the forest. They'd followed me, a lot of them too, and they'd been behind me the whole time. I ran until the sun came up, and I reached a highway, and then I kept on running until I saw a truck coming my way. I flagged it down frantically, my eyes darting between the trees and the truck, looking out for any goddamn inbreds running at me with antique rifles ready to fire. But the woods were empty and quiet, and there were no people out there coming for me. The guy behind the wheel thought that I was taking him hostage at first because after hopping into his passenger seat, dripping with sweat and holding my .45, I screamed at him to drive before he got his head blown off. He was relieved as hell when I started to thank him for picking me up and said that I'd wire him $100 if he just dropped me off at the next town. But once I told him what had happened, he told me so much payment was unnecessary and that he was just happy to help someone in need. I didn't mention the old guns, the weird dialect they were talking in, or that I might well have killed a man if even half the bullets I fired had hit him. Now, I shared that last part with my superiors, but not the first 2 parts. I didn't want them to think that I was going nuts or that I was embellishing my story to make it look like a clean shoot, and I ended up telling that story over and over and over again. I had to tell it a second time to the local sheriff's department and then again to 2 detectives from the state police once it was clear that something significant had taken place. It was tough on me mentally because the procedure stated that they were to treat it as a potential homicide until proven otherwise. They photographed the area, collected my .45 for ballistics testing, and searched the area for blood or bodies. They found plenty of the former, none of the latter, so murder was off the table. But I still had to undo the same multi-agency process mandated by Colorado law for officer-involved shootings. There was a recorded interview with a union rep. I was placed on paid leave, and then a couple of weeks later, the district attorney confirmed the use of deadly force was justified under self-defense statutes, which meant no charges and an immediate return to work following a psychological evaluation. I dressed it up like I'd run into some very aggressive poachers, guys who felt so disrespected that they'd rather kill a Fed than move off their patch of area. And I know that wasn't the whole story. I know the poachers don't have their own damn language that they speak among themselves, and I know they got better gear than muzzle-loading rifles that would have looked more at home in the Civil War. I've read a lot of crazy stuff online about who those men might have been, so much that honestly I don't know what to think anymore. I just know that there's folks out there in places people barely even know exist, and they've been living the same way for a long, long time now. And from what I can gather, they sure as hell don't like anyone showing up to try and change things. Last year, in the state of California, there were more than 1,200 log cabins listed for sale. About a third of those changed hands. Some were multi-story monstrosities which sold for millions of dollars, while others were a little more humble both on the outside and on the inside. Some places stay in the families for generations, getting passed down from one relative to the next until they finally either decide to sell it or make it livable. And either way, that's where I come in. I market my business as a kind of cabin renovation service, and I worked in tandem with various realtors for a quick turnaround. If someone was a little skeptical on buying a rundown old cabin, they often changed their tune when told their new purchase would be ready for sale or a vacation in just under 2 weeks. I work on around 50 to 20 cabins a year, fixing them up, dusting them off, and then spending a night or two there to make sure everything's working as it should be. It was something I kind of fell into after the crash in '08, and then when my old boss retired in 2013, and without any kids to pass it on to, the business went to me and I never looked back. I consider myself very lucky. I've worked on some incredible homes for some incredible people, but I also worked about a dozen or so jobs that didn't have the outcomes I was hoping for, and among them, there's one that I thought might end both my career and my life. Way back in 2015, so more than 10 years ago now, good lord, where's the time go, I got a call about a job. The guy said he just purchased a cabin up near Marble Mountain, way out in the woods for the peace and quiet. It was a nice place, but it hadn't been occupied in almost 5 years. All the cobwebs, bird nests, and accompanying bird poop had really knocked the price down, and so he managed to get himself a really good deal on it. And then when he'd asked about options for cleaning and renovation, the realtor had given him my number. I was only too happy to be of service, so I gave him my account details and asked him for the property's exact location. And that was one of the nifty things about my job, that it could be conducted almost entirely by email. But in this case, the man hiring me wanted to meet in person. And while that wasn't unusual, maybe 1 in 10 were old-timers who wanted a face-to-face, the way he acted just struck me as kind of odd. The first thing, and this didn't strike me as suspicious until much later for reasons I'll explain, but he showed up wearing a baseball cap and what could only be described as oversized sunglasses. Now this is Northern California, so a ball cap and shades is practically the uniform for any man over 30 here, and so his glasses didn't strike me as weird until later on when I tried to contact him again. The thing that did strike me as weird, and I'm talking right there upon meeting him, was the length of time he held my hand for after he shook it. I tried to pull it away after we shook hands, but he gripped it gently and held it firm for maybe 4 or 5 seconds after he stopped shaking. Now, after I pulled my hand away politely, he said something about being able to tell a lot about a man from his handshake, and then he invited me into the roadside diner he elected to meet at, and then we hashed out the specifics of the job over cups of coffee. He agreed to pay me half the money up front and then the other half plus expenses when the job was done. But when I asked him to transfer the first half in the next 48 hours or so, he told me he'd rather pay there and then, and in cash. That was the second thing that struck me as sort of odd about the job. I hadn't taken a cash payment since the very early days of taking over the business, as naturally, no one wanted to walk around with thousands of dollars in cash on them. But for some reason, this guy didn't mind at all. He seemed perfectly content to walk back to his car, take out an envelope stuffed with cash, and count out a couple of thousand and hundreds right there in front of me. I remember thinking, this guy is either rich, crazy, or both. But since his money was just as green as the next guy's, I took it, went home, and then drove out to the cabin in my truck the next morning. Despite making it out to be a wreck, the cabin wasn't that bad, but the guy was right about one thing, and that's just how secluded the place was. I had to drive down about 5 miles of dirt road before I found it and only got lost twice, and then apart from the animal sounds, the peace and quiet out there was phenomenal. I got to work right away, clearing out anything that looked like junk before I stacked the furniture and swept the floors. The place was a mess, with no one having given it any serious maintenance for at least 2 to 3 years. But after about 6 hours of solid work, it was close to being livable again. Close. But I still elected to sleep in my truck that night. That was a regular thing of mine, because a single man can't clean up an entire cabin in one day, not even if he starts at dawn and ends at dusk. And so I was used to sleeping out in the woods at night and having all kinds of deer and coyotes come wandering around my truck. After a couple of years, I always slept through the night, and that night was no different. I was out like a light just a couple of minutes after I reclined my seat, and then I didn't wake up until I saw the dawn breaking through the trees. I finished off the coffee I'd brought, had a smoke, and then got back to work. And then another 8 hours later, and with a huge bunch of trash piled up outside, the place was just about livable again. I'd cleared out the bedroom, replaced the mattresses and sheets, and then cleaned up the little living area and kitchen area too. These were nothing more than a table and chairs and a workspace and stove, and it was a long way from being anything like luxury, but it was still a fine place for what he'd paid for it. Now, there was just the matter of field testing it to make sure everything worked all right. I got to cleaning out the stove and then went about collecting up the firewood that I'd earned by chopping up an old moldy armchair. I loaded up the stove, made sure that it wasn't about to explode on me or anything, and then set about boiling up some water so I could make myself some noodles. Now, the place didn't have any running water, but I had a multi-pack of bottles that I kept in my truck, and so after a quick bottled water shower to make sure that I wasn't stinking too bad, I laid down on the new mattress and drifted off to sleep. I woke up a couple of hours later with a full bladder, and once I remembered where I was, I knew that I'd have to go outside to make a little piss. I rolled out of bed, admired my handiwork for a moment as I saw how much cleaner the bedroom was, and then slid on my boots and my bare feet before I started clunking across the wooden floor. But the second I did, I heard a voice coming from outside the cabin. It sounded brief and panicked almost, exactly how someone might sound if they suddenly realized someone was inside the cabin and awake. I used to keep a pump-action shotgun with me wherever I went out on a job, mainly for grizzlies, but it sure helped me feel safer around people too. And so the first thing I did was grab it and rack a shell nice and loud so whoever was outside would be able to hear it. Now I figured that they'd just run off at the first sign of trouble, and I'd hear them beating feet as soon as they heard that chunk of my shotgun. Now after I did, I heard one of the men outside crystal clear as he kinda loudly whispered, "Hurry up!" I immediately ran outside because I'm thinking, what the hell are these guys up to? And then once I was out there in the dark, I started yelling about how they were dead unless they got the hell away from the cabin. And that's when I saw the smallest of sparks in the darkness ahead of me, and then it flew, and then whoosh, the corner of the cabin where the bed just so happened to be went up in flames. I remember seeing 2 guys running with their backs to me, both lit up by the rush of that flame, but I didn't shoot, and I didn't chase them either. My mind went straight to preserving all of my hard work, so I ran to my truck to grab the fire extinguisher. Luckily, I'd interrupted the two men, at least I think it was two, at what must have been the most crucial moment of their venture. They'd been in such a rush once they'd heard someone was inside that they didn't take the time to actually cover a whole wall in what I can only assume was gasoline. So when they were forced to spark a match early, it didn't do anything like the damage they'd hoped, and I was able to put the fire out in just a couple of minutes. Once it was out, I remember dropping the extinguisher and grabbing my shotgun again. Then, I was so wired with adrenaline that all I did till sunup was circle the cabin with the shotgun in my grip, eyes and ears peeled for any kind of movement or sound. And once it was light enough, I tried to trace the path of the men's escape to see if they'd been camped out nearby or anything. But I'm not some tracker, so I didn't find anything. I just made my way back to the cabin and got packed up to leave. I didn't leave right away. I was still scared that those guys would come back and, for whatever reason, finish what they started. And so while I waited for 7:30 to roll around, which I thought was an appropriate time to call the client and give him the bad and very strange news, I did a few final laps of the cabin, some nice wide ones to make sure that no one was out there just waiting to creep in. And that's when I found the trail cams. Now, for those that don't know, a trail cam is just a camera that you put on a trail, mostly to record animals and their movement patterns and their behavior, but also sometimes for security. The trail cam I found tied to a branch looked to be just that, a creative way of providing security for the guy's new cabin, and I figured that because they looked to be almost brand new. And I say they because there were more than one. There were 5 in total, all brand new and all surrounding the cabin at what looked to be fairly even spacing, and as you can imagine, was very happy to see that they'd been recording. If they were the night vision kind, and by 2015 most were, then they'd have captured our arsonist in the act. I was hoping we'd have enough footage of the arsonist that they could be positively identified. All I needed to do was contact the client, inform him of the situation, then get him to share the recordings with the cops. But when 7:30 rolled around and I hit dial on the client's contact, I got nothing but a robotic voice saying, "We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected and is no longer in service." I remember just standing there outside the cabin for a second, wondering why the hell a client would disconnect a phone like that, when I suddenly felt this strange chill come over me. I was hired by a guy with what felt like oversized sunglasses, and then someone tried to burn the cabin down with me inside of it. And then when I tried contacting the client, their phone was dead. And what's more, if the guy wanted security, why not hook the cameras up to the cabin itself? I started to suspect that they weren't there to record anyone who approached the cabin, but rather the cabin itself. In which case, did the client really want to protect his new investment, or were those cameras there to simply record the cabin being burned down? Now, the first thing that came to mind was some kind of insurance scam. But then, as I thought about it, I remembered how these arsonists didn't stop trying to burn the place down when they realized I was inside. In fact, one of them actually said hurry up once they realized someone was there. And that's when the creeping feeling started to get way more intense, because it dawned on me that they weren't just trying to burn the cabin down. They wanted to wait until I was inside of it before roasting me alive. And that's why nothing happened on that first night. They probably snuck up to the cabin, saw me sleeping in my truck, and then retreated until the next night when they could try again. But why? And what beef did these dudes have with a client that they wanted to burn his property down, and why would they want me inside when they set the place on fire? Those are the kind of questions I've struggled with over the years, wondering to what extent my client was in league with the men who tried to burn me alive. I can't help but think that they were connected somehow. I mean, why would he make such an effort to obscure his face, pay me in cash, and then disconnect the phone he'd used to contact me? I also can't help but wonder, why me? Was I picked out specifically, or did they just need any poor bastard in there when it burned down? And when it comes to whether I was specifically chosen, I think the answer is yes. I think about the guy in the oversized glasses and the way he gripped my hand after I tried to pull it out of the shake. And I told the cops about him and passed on a description of the man in his car, as well as the cell number that he'd used to contact me. This might not come as a surprise, but they had no luck in finding him, and since that was expected, it didn't bother me too much. But what does bother me is the way that guy acted after we shook hands. I know now that he was sizing me up in some way. I don't know by what criteria, but I know that when he invited me into the diner for some coffee, he decided that I was the right man for the job. But the question is, at least the one that I struggle with the most these days, did he pick me to fix up his cabin, or did he pick me out to die in it? This is the story of what might be the single worst thing to ever happen in my life, and kind of ironically, it started with a vacation. Because back in the fall of 1987, my girlfriend of 2 years suggested a weekend in a log cabin. Kate, not her real name, had fallen in love with the idea of living this remote, rustic lifestyle after reading some historical romance novel. But while she knew that she wouldn't last more than a week out there chopping firewood and gutting deer carcasses, we both thought that it'd be very romantic and pretty cool to spend a few days playing pretend. We found a place out in Vermont that had all the peace and seclusion that we were looking for, but one that also had a kitchen, a feather bed, and a bathroom with hot running water. It set us back a few $100, but after we drove out on the Friday afternoon for check-in and collected the keys from a man in the nearby town of Bartlett, we discovered it was worth every penny. This place was beautiful. All the appliances were spotless and working okay, but the wood-burning stove was worth the price of admission alone because not only did it keep us nice and toasty, but it gave the whole place this kind of rustic and cozy feel. That first night was fantastic, everything we could have hoped for, and then the next day, we took a walk into town to get some food before hiking back to the cabin and settling for the evening to get some well-deserved rest. We both changed into our evening wear and were sharing the big 3-seater couch, each reading the books that we brought with us when, out of nowhere, we heard someone's voice coming from outside. Now, seconds later, there was a heavy knocking on the front door of the cabin. Kate told me not to answer it because who the heck would be out there so late at night in the middle of nowhere, too? And then came another round of banging on the door before someone called out,
Please, I'm hurt. I need help.
Kate and I both looked at each other, and then I remember blurting out something like,
We don't have a phone here. We can't call anyone.
I guess it was the practical thing to say while keeping Kate sweet and not opening the door. But then we both heard the same panic-stricken voice tell us, and with a dash of fear too, that they were hurt real bad and that they were scared that they were going to die. I looked at Kate and said we needed to do something, and she agreed, so we rushed to the door and opened it. We were greeted by the sight of a man in hiking gear. Big coat, boots, woolen hat with dark eyes and a mustache. But what really caught my attention was all the blood that seemed to be seeping from the hole of his jacket, while he kept one hand clamped over it at all times. He stumbled into the cabin and then collapsed near the couch, panting and thanking us before begging us to lock the door again. He said he'd been stabbed and that he'd run a long way to get away from the people who did it, but he was still scared that they'd catch up to him somehow. My first thought was to drive the guy into town and to the nearest ER, so I grabbed my keys and ran for my car. My plan was to move it closer to the cabin so the guy wouldn't have to stumble very far to flop into the back seat. But when I put my key in the ignition and turned it, silence. The engine wouldn't start. I tried over and over, yelling and screaming, and then rushed around to the front to pop the hood. I looked around, and the moment I saw some cut wires, I ran back into the cabin to tell Kate what needed to be done. First off, I was going to have to run into town, and if I went full jog the whole way, that'd take another 20 to 25 minutes. And while I was away, she needed to grab a knife, lock all the doors and windows, and then turn the lights off and stay very quiet. I figured if someone came by and found the place was empty, they might move on and not try to look inside. But if they did, and they pushed past all the furniture I told Kate to push in front of the door to blockade, she needed to run. I didn't say that in front of that guy. I said it quietly before I left, because as much as the Christian thing to do was to help this dude and save his life, I didn't want her to die from some total stranger. It was a crazy thing to have to tell her, but it was a crazy situation we were in, I guess. And then after giving her a kiss, I started running back to the dirt road and kept going like that for 3.5 miles before I finally arrived in that town I mentioned earlier, Bartlett. Now, there wasn't an ER there, but I found a guy named Andrew with a working car who said he'd call 911 from his place before driving me back to the cabin so we could make sure that Kate and that stranger were okay. We rushed into his house, and I remember barely being able to get any words out from having run so hard and for so long, but we got there in the end, and then we jumped into his car and he sped off with him following the same directions I'd just given him. I think I must have thanked him 100 times between running into him in the street and getting him back to the cabin, but then when we pulled up outside and saw the lights were still off, I was relieved. I pictured Kate and the stranger sitting quietly in the dark, not knowing who was sitting behind the wheel of the car approaching them. But then, all it'd take was one quick yell of, "It's me," and they'd just be as relieved as I was when Andrew said he'd help me. I got out of his car and walked towards the cabin's front door. I yelled out to identify myself and then got ready to push past the barricade that Kate had blocked off the door with, but as I got close, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. I called out again, but no one responded, and that's when I started to panic. Kate hadn't pushed anything in front of the door, and when I walked into the room with the couch where I'd last seen her and the wounded stranger, it was empty. Now, I ran around like a headless chicken looking for them, but when I found Kate alone in the bedroom, there was no relief that time, because she'd been stripped, severely beaten, and was laying unconscious on the floor next to the bed. I didn't even take all that much comfort in the fact an ambulance was on its way to us and that whatever injuries she'd received, they'd soon be treated. All that was in my head were all these questions, like when did they find her? Why didn't she run like we'd agreed? And what the hell happened to the wounded stranger? It took another 24 hours to get any answers because Kate was barely conscious when we got her to the hospital, and she had to rest up a bunch before anyone could even talk to her. But when she finally did talk, it was devastating. She and the stranger hadn't been found by the people looking for him. She'd been attacked by the man himself. Kate said that not long after I ran off, she grabbed some dishcloths from the kitchen and tried to open up the guy's jacket to put pressure on the wound and keep him from bleeding to death. And that's when he dropped the act. He hit her, jumped up, then kept on hitting and kicking her until she was too weak to fight back. The guy hadn't been stabbed. He wasn't hurt in any way, shape, or form. The whole thing was an act, a complete put-on that he'd hoisted on us after disabling my car, stabbing a hole in his jacket, and then using a little fake blood for the finishing touches. Now the rest he achieved by sheer force of personality and by the fear that I thought that I saw in his eyes, which I guess looking back on it was more like excitement at the prospect of what he was about to do. They did end up catching the guy, and he ended up getting life because it wasn't the first time he'd violated a woman after tricking his way into her home. But Kate has never fully recovered. She might have since found some kind of peace, and I hope she has. We haven't spoken in a long time now, but I sincerely hope that she has. But sadly, in what remained of our relationship, she was unable to find it. She said I reminded her of what happened and how since that wasn't my fault and there wasn't anything I could do about it, she knew we had no future together. It broke my heart, but I respected her wishes, and we slowly drifted apart over the years that followed. Kate, if somehow you're listening, I know you'll recognize this story, and I'm sorry if you hate the fake name I picked for you, but I hope and pray that you're doing better. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, PvE plus friendly fire equals PvP.